Good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this Absa South African Chamber of Commerce webinar, a series of webinars that we shall be running for the rest of this year. Some actually might not be webinars. We're actually looking forward to doing some in-person events as well for the Chamber, as well as with Absa Bank. So thank you very much for joining us from Absa. We've got Bhavtik Vallabhjee, who is the head of power and renewables for Absa in their London branch. That's Absa Investment Bank London branch. We also have with us Peter Attard Montalto, who is a director of the South African Chamber and well-versed in interviewing people in the energy space. I am Sharon Constanson. I'm chairman of the South African Chamber of Commerce, and I welcome everyone who has joined us here today. If you hear strange noises, I do apologize. I'm in an airport building doing my best to multitask. So thanks for your patience in that respect. The objective of the Chamber, obviously, is to be relevant to all our members, to ensure that we can give of our best to them and bring them high quality content that is of interest to different groups of people. So we have various different activities going on throughout the year. And at this particular time, we're welcoming Bhavtik and Peter to give him a hard time, because that's what Peter always does. But the focus of what we're going to be talking about today is the Africa Energy Forum and what actually got discussed at that event. What were the key themes that came from it, and how are those likely to link into COP27, which is coming up later in the year? So that, without further ado, Peter, Director of the Chamber, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Welcome, everyone. We're obviously at a very key juncture here in the global energy and geopolitical space, with the moves in energy prices that we've seen this year, particularly in gas, obviously, and oil prices now being felt throughout the continent into inflation as well. We know that particularly in South Africa, a very strong inflation print yesterday of 7.4%, driven in part by petrol prices. A lot of debate going on around investments and what energy choices should be made by what countries in this kind of geopolitical environment in particular. And so the African Energy Forum, which happened at the end of June, which all the energy movers and shakers like Bhavtik and Absa will have been at, it happened at a sort of key juncture. Basically, many of the themes that came up there still very relevant. So we're going to cover, I think, quite a lot of ground today about it. There's a lot to talk about. Maybe you just want to give some of your initial sort of high-level impressions and just sort of lay the scene for people around the conference, given a lot of different issues were discussed. What were your sort of key takeaways for the year ahead from the conference, and particularly from a banking perspective, but also, from an energy security, energy mix perspective as well?
Good morning, Peter. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you to Sharon and the team. Look, I think you've hit it on the nail. I think the African Energy Forum is very much a premier energy event on the calendar every year, and things are back to normal, post-COVID. Some of the key highlights, once again, that have been reinforced are topics such as the whole decarbonization drive, right? Energy transition. Just when we thought it was going to be a very big push towards renewables, you have a skyrocketing of commodity prices, although there's been some correction on certain commodities by virtue of scares on recession globally. But certainly you've seen coal-fired plants coming back into the fray, the whole talk about gas and the future of gas again. Some of the other discussions that we're going alongside in the African Energy Forum were topics around transmission, right? So it's well and good to have great plans for the generation side of things on electricity, but unless you're able to evacuate power and transmit that power to where it's actually needed at those specific load centers, without grid capacity, doesn't help the cause, as we are experiencing right now in South Africa, just hot on the heels of round 5, where many projects did not get through purely because of a lack of access to the transmission grid. So there's some big themes that are underway, it seems, in South Africa on the transmission side. The other things that we saw was again, the whole talk about green hydrogen. Africa, including South Africa, is blessed with a lot of great natural resources, glorious sunlight, great wind speeds. And I think it is probably an opportune time for Africa to capitalize if they get their act together quickly enough on the whole theme for green hydrogen, especially now where you know that ammonia is a very big feedstock into the production of fertilizers. And essentially green hydrogen can be used for the production of ammonia and hence for fertilizers. And with what's going on with Russia, Ukraine, they certainly talk about alternative sources and gradually weaning off over-reliance, if I may call it that, on Russia for gas. Some of the other themes, battery metals, we've always had a very big link between natural resources and energy, whether it was oil or gas, etc. You're now finding that there's a slight twist in things where this whole talk about energy storage has actually come forth, and hence the whole need for metals. Very broadly, those are what I've seen.
Interesting. I mean, we saw a relatively joined up voice from African governments at COP26. We're hearing that again, starting already, actually, pre COP27. Is that making a difference on the ground at forums like we're talking about in terms of actual projects, actual ability to get financing, or are we still seeing a pretty patchwork, set of different country narratives, funding remaining relatively tight in the grand scheme of things? Is the government chatter feeding through to projects and financing?
Look, I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. I think, we hate to see a COP being another talk shop. What we really want to see is action on the ground, right? And the last, several months with the onslaught of what's happened with, in Europe with Russia, Ukraine, they certainly are moves afoot to try and extend the time frame for getting to net zero. Right? So you've just seen announcements by India, they're actually talking from 2050, moving it out to 2070, right? And similarly, there's been from other countries like Germany and other countries in Europe where they are trying to switch back on the coal-fired power plants. All of a sudden, nuclear has actually become green enough. It's always been green, but now being counted into the net for renewables. So I think in terms of actually seeing money flowing into projects in Africa, it has been slow, and the situation that we've seen over the last few months has not helped, right? Where all of a sudden it's really about energy access as opposed to the greatest care for the environment. That is actually counterintuitive as what you've seen in Europe over this past week and in the UK on Monday and Tuesday with a massive heat wave. So I do think that, if anything, my own view, the whole surge in commodity prices, etc., is going to actually result in more investment, possibly in demand side management, etc., the push towards renewables. Noting very well that, look, you are never going to get away from fossil fuel generation. You need that to complement and supplement whatever energy you actually generate from renewables, right? To just give you the sort of base load effect of constant power. So that is my take.
And there seems to be a very fractious debate going on globally, and particularly on the continent around, and you started to bring this up in terms of access to energy versus decarbonisation. It doesn't feel like that debate particularly is resolving. It's become very sort of embittered, I think, between advocates, different technology types, etc. At the forum itself, did you feel like that debate made any particular progress or is resolving? And how is that particularly affecting financing? Obviously, we have increasingly activist investors who are trying to close the space for a wider technology mix, etc. It feels like it's a very constrained space to have that debate between energy access and like those. Actually, maybe if we think more innovatively about rolling out renewables plus batteries, etc., there are ways of squaring this circle, to mix my metaphors somewhat on that. What are your thoughts?
So look, I think unfortunately, just as we were reeling from the effects of COVID, we've had a recession, that's possibly imminent, high inflation rates, etc. What you've seen during the onslaught of COVID is there had certainly been a reprioritization of objectives by governments in Africa, right? A lot of push towards healthcare, hospitals, etc. And very much what you've seen is some of the larger infrastructure projects have actually been put on the back burner or have been very slow to be rolled out, right? And unfortunately, the funding has never really been an issue, whether you're talking about debt, whether it's from commercial banks or developmental financial institutions. We've always had more than enough funding out there. What we actually lack, unfortunately, is the projects that are readily packaged, appropriate for the investment community, whether it's the sponsor side on equity or whether it is the debt side for commercial banks and DFIs to actually come in. In other words, what I'm saying is what we've lacked in Africa really is bankable projects that are ready for funding, right? So, and I think this is where we kind of lose the plot a little bit in Africa, right? And I think a lot more attention needs to be paid in that regard. And the funding will come, right? So when you talk to funds and when you talk to sponsors, whether in Europe or elsewhere, you find that there's absolutely no shortage of liquidity for the right projects. But what is lacking are appropriately structured projects that are bankable and are ready for them to come in. And I think the front end is where we need to spend more time to get those projects ready before we can solicit investment.
Did you pick up in the forum at all any sort of best in class or examples of where is working? It seems, some countries are managing this at scale, whether it's Egypt on renewables. We're seeing people moving relatively fast, like Namibia on hydrogen. Are there some best practices that other countries can learn from?
Well, I think, and I hate picking on South Africa all the time because it's, the African Energy Forum is not about South Africa, it's about an African event. But I think the one sort of accolade that must go to South Africa is, what they've done successfully in the past, whereby they've created a nice, robust structure, a bankable program with the right support, albeit with the challenges that we have with our utility ESCOM. To enable rapid rolling out of projects, right? Nowhere on the continent do you have that sort of scale of 92 projects on renewables alone as IPPs being rolled out in a period of 10 or 11 years, right? So I think certainly South Africa does stand out in the crowd. I would certainly single out as well Egypt, right? So there is this certain amount of traction that we're seeing in Egypt. And Morocco in terms of renewables, right? So Morocco obviously has got a large proportion of its generation mix coming from coal, fossil fuels, and they're also trying to, wean themselves off that, right? You have a country that has got glorious resource, wind speeds, etc., on that western part of Africa, and you are not far from Europe. So, there's always been talk about, and I'm aware of a project that's being developed undersea for transmission of projects. Transmission of power from Morocco into Europe. So I think those are the sort of green shoot areas from my perspective. In terms of green hydrogen, absolutely, I think there are some countries that have made a bit more progress than others, albeit that there's still, that lot needs to be accomplished before we can say that the commercial banking community in Africa is really ready to take on funding of green hydrogen. And countries such as Namibia, seems to have made a fair amount of headway with their program and thoughts around that. There are a few large sponsors in South Africa. I won't single any here, but certainly, there are a couple of initiatives being looked at in South Africa as well. And I think when you start looking at one of the largest polluters of greenhouse gas emissions globally is actually the shipping industry, right? It's actually number 5 in the world. And when you look at the opportunity set that actually exists for the transportation sector, specifically shipping, I think that in itself could be a great opportunity, right? Whether you're thinking about green hydrogen, production of ammonia, or whether you're looking at just refueling ships through the use of hydrogen, as opposed to bunker oil, which is highly pollutant. Right. And I think one of the other things that came out, not at the African Energy Forum, but at its predecessor, the mining indaba in Cape Town was where you saw Anglo American, as an example, announcing the prototype for its mining trucks to be fueled by hydrogen. So that is certainly a theme I would watch very closely, and you will see, in my opinion, a fair amount of traction over the next 2 to 5 years.
Definitely, there's certainly some innovation going on. If we stick to the topic of where it's going right, maybe, I mean, the thing that links Morocco, Egypt, and the case around the REAP program in South Africa is relatively well-known, cookie cutter, legal certainty around RFPs, etc. Why is this not more easily applicable elsewhere? Why can't this kind of thing be deployed in many other countries?
Well, in my humble opinion, I think one of the things that South Africa got right was exactly what I alluded to earlier on. They spent a fair amount of time at the front end of the program, hiring the right consultants, getting a program that was bankable, appropriate risk allocation from a sponsor perspective, for the banking community, etc. And once they got that, once they got standardized documents in place with the right sort of credit support for the off-taker, the utility Eskom, then basically what you were able to do very rapidly is copy and paste those document set and roll out projects very quickly. What you have not done is having to reinvent the wheel each time for every single project, right? And unfortunately, this is really where we are lacking in many countries in Africa. By and large, there's not appropriate risk allocation. There isn't a proper, bankable PPA. I'm just generalizing, and there's exceptions, but generally that's what's lacking. You don't have this robust program. You also have, governments that are a little bit stretched financially, so they're not easily able to stand by their utility in the form of providing support. And all of that kind of adds leeway to the lead time to actually, get projects off the ground. And that's why it takes so long. And I think that's where South Africa has really been able to differentiate itself. It spent a fair amount of money with the right consultants to make sure that there was a robust program, bankable, etc. And that's, culminated in 92 projects, as I said, over 10, 12 years.
No, I think that's a great point. I think maybe some of the frustration elsewhere in the continent is that there are clearly success stories that are easy, quote unquote, to roll out. Though obviously things are happening elsewhere on the continent. I think we talk about scale here, right, as opposed to simply not anything happening. But in this African case,
I must say, sorry, I would just add an analogy to that. I mean, on average in Africa, it takes anything between 8 to 10 years to actually roll out an infrastructure project from cradle to the grave, to financial close, right? Now, that is a long time. The last thing you really need is to add further complexity to it, where you don't have things that are actually swaying your way, right, in the form of delays, in the form of a lack of a robust framework or a regulatory environment, or contractual documents, etc., that are not up to scratch. So this is where I believe that if governments get their act together in that regard, it can only actually add value to them in the long run.
No, I think that's a great point, definitely. I mean, the need for speed here is certainly very apparent. Thinking about net zero in 2050, or even solving energy access, energy security problems more urgently. But if we think about South Africa, South Africa's had its fair share of problems recently, load shedding most obviously, but in terms of procurement as well, we still haven't closed REAP projects since 2014. The bid window 5 has got into a bit of a pickle. We'll come on to the detail of that in a minute, but where in the African Energy Forum did you find that South Africa is sort of ranking in sort of relative interest, given some of these issues versus other countries? What was people's level of excitement or concern around South Africa versus peers?
I think the excitement continues primarily because of the scale that South Africa exudes, and I think the other thing is the sort of consternation arises as to how much of appetite is there by the local banking community, because remember, a lot of the REAP projects have really been funded by South African banks, not international banks. So how big is the access to liquidity in South Africa to continue funding the sort of scale that South Africa is talking about? And there's still 14.5 gigawatts between now and 2030 that is actually planned, roughly 1,200 to 1,400 megawatts on an annual basis, right? that is in addition to, this is renewables that I'm talking about, that in addition to 3,500 megawatts of gas-fired power generation that's planned. Then you've got potentially cross-border hydro, and there's a massive amount of funding that's actually required for infrastructure upgrade of the network, right, of the transmission grid. So I think that the access to liquidity is somewhat of a concern. And I think the other thing is, everybody knows about the restructure that is underway with regards to Eskom. And, ultimately, I think the detail is really what matters, right? How is this going to be unbundled? Where are the liabilities that Eskom actually has currently going to be carved into which of the entities, transmission, generation, etc.? And, what is that entity going to look like that is going to be the off-taker from a balance sheet structure perspective? So all of those sort of issues, I think I have been aware of a couple of sponsors in earlier rounds where they've actually consulted certain institutions internationally for political risk insurance, right? So there are different sort of concerns from different camps within the sponsor community, but I think none of them are are issues that are deal breakers or that cannot be addressed adequately. I think the interest continues to remain in South Africa by virtue of the scale over the short to medium term that's actually planned.
If we think about the other big challenge you touched on before, which is transmission, there's been a lot. It feels like there have been a large number of projects from various people going on the continent on transmission, as opposed to in South Africa, and we've seen the private sector being able to come in elsewhere, with people like Gridworks and others elsewhere in the continent. But do you think anyone is getting the transmission side right yet? We've basically seen no transmission investment, particularly in South Africa, despite 100 but depending on what number you read, a 170 billion rand requirement for transmission investment. Who is sort of getting it right on the transmission side?
Well, I think, yes, I fully agree with you. I don't think enough is actually being done on the transmission side. So if you look at Europe as an example, you have a very integrated grid. Right? So if in a particular period you have a bad wind, bad wind speeds in, say, Germany, the grid is so interconnected that you could easily import nuclear power from France cross-border, right? So that is the benefit that you have in Europe, a very integrated grid. We don't have that in Africa. So you literally have 5 power pools, and each one is kind of very independent. And it's not an integrated network across the continent, right? A vast African continent. So you have the Southern African power pool, the East African power pool, West Africa, Central Africa, and North Africa. And each one is very disjointed. Right? So where you have a situation of surplus in one area, it's not easy for you to evacuate to an area where there's a rapid need, right? So I think we're not getting that right. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. If there is a power pool that seems to be kind of working a little bit, it's actually the Southern African power pool. But I think there's a long way for them to go before they get to the likes of what you have in Europe, the Nord pool, etc., right? Or even in the US. I think the one project or one sponsor I would kind of single out to answer your question is really Global and what they are doing in Mozambique, right? With the big gas Cuambo project, the big gas IPP. And we know that they have been working with the World Bank to actually, build a massive transmission line to enable the evacuation of power, right? Mozambique's got gas, you've got, glorious hydro resource. But again, what you have is the north and the south of the country is not actually linked. And if you have a project in the south, to get power to the north without the transmission grid, it's actually a futile exercise. So I think once that is up and running with the support of the World Bank, that will be a game changer for Mozambique and will unleash a number of other projects. Right? So Mozambique obviously is blessed with a lot of hydro potential, gas potential, good, natural resources for wind and solar, and obviously a lot of coal, but I don't see that happening. But the transmission grid is really the precursor to being able to unleash more projects on the generation. And I think if you get that done, then certainly countries that are energy hungry, energy intensive countries such as South Africa with a lot of mining and smelting could benefit from power cross-border, like what you've had with the hydro project in Mozambique, the Koharabasa project. And I think the other one is, it's always been said that the DRC, the Inga river basically has enough water capacity to generate more than 40,000 megawatts of power. And how long has that project, been on the radar? We just haven't moved, right? And Africa remains where it is from a power access perspective compared to, say, now versus what it was 10, 20, 25 years ago. I mean, that is something that's just not taken off. So I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And we need the help of the international agencies such as DFIs, multilateral such as the World Bank, et cetera, ECAs.
There's going to be something I wanted to dwell on a bit, was who is the sort of marginal dollar of investment here, and who needs to be to kick this off on the continent, on both the generation and the transmission side. I mean, at COP26 we saw huge numbers globally and for the region churned out there. A lot of very high profile reports coming out from GFANs and all these other people, but actually very, very little really has happened since COP26 on the financing side at scale, at least. Who needs to be that sort of marginal funder, the marginal de-risker in the system to move this forward?
Look, you're right. I think a lot was promised at COP26, and we yet to see those funding. $8.5 billion were actually pledged by the US, UK, France, and Germany over a period of 3 to 5 years. We're not a full year yet from COP26, so time will tell. But I think we haven't seen those funds really flowing into the region, right? And so I think Absa has the great accolade of saying that its former group CEO at Absa, Daniel Mnele, has actually been seconded to the presidential office, to actually spearhead that investment and spearhead the charge, to access and roll out that $8.5 billion that was actually promised to South Africa. And obviously, we have a different problem on our hands as South Africa, because we're a country that is still very heavily dependent on coal-fired power generation, right? So we have a lot more to actually do and accomplish from transitioning to cleaner technologies. And I think that is where that big amount was actually coming from, right, in the form of pledge. But yes, look, the short answer, we haven't seen that money rolling into Africa yet. I cannot single out a single country that stands out. And of that $8.5 billion, I think a fair amount, in my opinion, should be allocated to the transmission side, so that you can help with the plans as per the integrated resources plan to roll out renewable energy generation in South Africa.
And then how is Absa working with DFIs and these sorts of pots of money to accelerate things? Is it important at this stage of development on the continent and in South Africa to have partners like that to de-risk and to maybe take project decisions that credit committees and others maybe wouldn't otherwise do, or would take too long to do?
Yeah, no, look, absolutely. Look, I think the reality is we have great relationships with all the developmental financial institutions. I think their need exists more in some countries, or their appetite really exists more for certain countries than others. South Africa is slightly different in that it's recognized as a sort of middle income country. Many DFIs do not generally have the same appetite that they have for South Africa, by virtue of it being a bit more advanced, if you want to call it that, compared to some of our northern neighbors. And I think so in certain other countries, there's a greater role for DFIs to play in the form of access to liquidity in hard currency in particular, the ability to access hard currency over longer tenors, and potentially to access that hard currency at a slightly cheaper rate. Remember that DFIs do not have the same constraints on them as a commercial bank would have with regard to Basel 3 or 4, right? And so they're able to lend in hard currency, be it euros or dollars, or CFA franc pegged to the euro, a lot more competitively than a South African bank can, as an example, because our funding is really coming off a rand balance sheet, right? So those are issues that we need to bear in mind. But I think we work very closely with DFIs, especially when there's a larger project. It's often multi-sourced, multi-tranched, potentially multi-currency, and there's a need for all of us to kind of coexist with the common objective of getting projects across the line. So, we do not see a need for either the commercial banks or the DFIs to crowd each other out. We should be working jointly and collectively for a common purpose in Africa.
And I was wondering, in South Africa versus other countries on the continent, and we're seeing the rise increasingly of embedded generation of small-scale embedded generation on people's rooftops, etc. South Africa is obviously charging down this route now with the rise in the registration licensing threshold last year. How do banks treat this versus much larger utility scale projects? It's obviously there's more due diligence to do. There's more work for a large number of smaller projects. How in South Africa and elsewhere on the continent do you sort of manage the split between those different sorts of projects, and where do you see really the focus going forward?
Peter, that's a great question. And, I firmly am of the opinion that the future of renewable energy in Southern Africa, or certainly South Africa, lies in the embedded generation space. What we are seeing as a commercial bank is a host of projects on the embedded generation with captive power generation space, particularly on mines and large industrials. If the changing of the threshold upper limit of 100 megawatts without the requirement for a generation license in South Africa by NERSA has basically opened the floodgates for the development of these projects. Now, many of these projects are, I would say, at a sort of mid to sort of late stage development. They're not too many that I can count on. In fact, none that have really closed. And there's been many that have been, under development for a few years. But our count, or our estimate, is that there are at least 4,500 megawatts of projects just for the mining sector alone that are being contemplated, right, at different stages of project development. So I think the floodgates have opened, and certainly I would watch that space in terms of precedent and in terms of the number of projects in the captive generation side, or embedded generation, as you call it, being closed over the next 2, 3, 4 years. In fact, certainly not a small number to disregard or ignore. And the beauty of it is you don't have the same regulatory red tape that you have when you're looking at a national program that is run through large RFPs and internationals competing. The embedded generation space can also be quite competitive, but I think you are able to move at a far more rapid pace than you would on the REAP program, as an example.
But does the REAP program then die off because of the red tape? I mean, the sheer amount of requirements, obviously, if one reads the RFPs page after page of different bits of red tape and requirements, but some of them are also positive, right, in terms of social economic development.
Absolutely.
What's your of that utility scale type procurement?
Look, I think there's a need for both of them to kind of coexist. I think, the current CEO at Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, has been very, forthright in his thinking, right? And he's basically said that, look, it's all about energy access. And, his view is that if Eskom is not in a position to actually deliver energy, and it's actually hampering mining, or it's hampering economic development, then, he's quite open-minded in saying, look, they should be, their ability to self-generate, whether it's mines, etc. Right? So, and I think that's great, because basically there's a need for both of these to kind of run in parallel, right? I think at the moment, Eskom has a sort of different need, right? So I think there's still a very social element to, getting the energy access up, generating power in certain impoverished communities, etc. As you know, they're large areas and some of the former township areas, etc. Right? Because people haven't been paying, and they just feel there's a right to access to energy. Whereas I think in the mining sector, it's a different objective. It's a different risk allocation, right? They are actually generating these projects or setting up these projects to generate their own power for, to continue business or continue mining operations or their smelting operations. So they have a very different objective. And, I don't think one is going to necessarily die and, the other will, thrive, right? So I think there's a need for both of them. I also believe that the risk allocation is different. The returns are also very different. If you look at REAP in South Africa over the last round, tariffs have really been, sharply on a decline. I don't think it will be the same case in the next round, in round 6, where you have all these global pressures with inflation, et cetera, price pressure on EPC, very likely to see, tariffs going up in the next round compared to round 5 and REAP. But generally, what you're finding on these utility scale projects is it's really now become the domain of the large international IPPs, the large developers that are able to withstand slightly lower returns and have large teams that they can deploy. They have access to deep pockets. They have economies of scale from a procurement perspective, whether it's wind turbines or solar modules, and all of that can collectively enable them to take on a slightly lower return. Whereas I think with a mine, etc., it is a different allocation. You don't have the same sort of credit support from SA Inc., as an example, Ministry of Finance backing Eskom, right? It's really a mining entity, and you have different risks. You're looking at the commodity price, you're looking at the outlook on that commodity, you're looking at the political risk, outlook in a particular country, wherever it's being run, the life of the mine. It's a very different dynamic. So I think there's a room for both of these programs.
There's been some criticism of banks around the embedded generation market potentially, because as you say, the REAP market has government guarantees, etc. It's it's an easier credit to handle as opposed to single off-takers, etc. for embedded and wheeled projects. Do you think what do you think we need to see much more bank financing into that space? Do we need to see tradable markets, multiple off-takers? We have a new Electricity Regulation Act currently being considered in South Africa. What can make the financing of that space a lot more smooth for projects?
Look, you must remember that the embedded generation spaces, if I want to call it that, it's a relatively new asset class, right? Whereas REAP is 12 years old already. So, over the last 2 years, I've certainly seen that commercial banks have actually come of age, right? The thought process has completely changed compared to, say, 2.5, 3 years ago. I think we are finding that commercial banks are getting more, I wouldn't say cowboys, but they're certainly getting a bit more aggressive in terms of their funding terms, whether it's a structure, whether it is pricing, whether it's tenors, right? So, and it's really a function of them getting more comfortable with what it entails, right? And the 100 megawatt cap is just one issue, but there are many other things. I think, whereas, so I think that is on the right trajectory as it is. Look, I mean, I think it's just time, and it's just getting more comfort, and I've seen that mindsets have certainly changed, with time, right? What you are seeing, the innovation that you are seeing now, is things where the landscape in the energy sector in South Africa now versus, say, maybe 5 or 10 years from now could potentially be very different. You will probably have a very deregulated market. You will probably have a lot more competition, right? And whereas Eskom years bygone was almost the sole generator of power, you are now having a prolific number of IPPs entering the space, right? I think you are probably going to find that as the market deregulates, there could potentially be more trading. You're finding part of the structures that banks are looking at now is sort of merchant risk, right? Your life of your solar modules are now 30 years or thereabout, and PPAs are 20 years. Well, they're saying, look, if the market is deregulated, there could potentially be a lot more buyers of the power at the end of the 20-year PPA life, right? So if it's not a mine, it could be another municipality, etc. So all of this innovation is actually keeping into the thought process and types of structures that we're thinking, in terms of funding these projects. So very exciting times, no doubt.
No, exactly. I think if we can get some of those factors around tradability, some of the things in place around wheeling, especially, and standardization of wheeling, which is taking a little while, then this can certainly take off and make banks' lives a lot easier. The other key sort of controversial issue in both embedded and things like REAP at the moment is particularly local content, and it feels like with the amount of demand on the continent as a whole, with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, there should be the emergence of some on continent and maybe onshore into Africa manufacturing, but it's not really happening yet. I was wondering what Absa was trying to do in terms of funding that, in terms of helping the development of manufacturing overall, and are local content rules the way to go about it? Do we not maybe need to wait for more of an organic emergence of an industry? What are your thoughts on local content?
Look, that is really a double-edged sword, in my opinion, because at the end of the day, South Africa is not necessarily a low-cost destination, right? And if I take just solar modules, the world over, really, the manufacturing hub for these has really been not Europe, not Germany as it was years bygone. It's really China, right? And the reality is there's always a trade-off between price and tariff. And if there is a push for the lowest tariff, for value for money, as it were, as a PPP, then what you've got to remember, trying to force the localization agenda, and I can perfectly understand where government is coming from with regards to the thought process around localization. But the reality is, if the agenda is really focused towards low tariff, you cannot have a lower tariff and have localization at the same time, right? Because they talk to two very different agendas, right? Because we are not a low-cost manufacturing hub in South Africa, that is, right? So I think this is where there's a bit of disingenuity, if I may call it that, right? And I think the parties, the role players need to talk to one another and understand that dynamic. Now, what you will find is, as projects kind of get scattered around, right, because you have a bottleneck on the transmission side on wind and solar in the Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, Western Cape for wind, Northern Cape for solar, as projects get more scattered around the country, tariffs will naturally become less of an issue, because you're not getting necessarily the best solar radiation or wind speeds, right? So, so that whole dynamic will change. But the reality is, my opinion is, it's very contradictory right now, where, as it stands, you're pushing low tariffs, but at the same time trying to force the agenda for localization, which has not worked, right? We've seen on the wind towers, there have been two companies. One is actually, went bust. On the solar module side, just not been a success story as well on knockdown assembly of solar modules in South Africa. So yeah, I think a lot more work needs to be done. But if I may, take that discussion a step further, I think similarly, if you start looking at, Africa being blessed with a lot of battery metals, right? Whether it's nickel or vanadium or lithium ion, whatever it is, I think the issue is we need to do a lot more to capitalize on the manufacturing base in that regard, right? So the whole talk about electric vehicles, EV, etc., I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I think government has a big hand to play. And we've done it. And if I look at South Africa, if I look at the MIDP, the Motor Industries Development Plan, what the government of South Africa had actually done on the auto sector, I think those sort of initiatives can be replicated to capitalize on hydrogen, to capitalize on energy, storage, battery metals, all of those things. So a lot more work needs to be done. And I think we need to give more thought to it as to how we capture that in Africa. And, it's not just South Africa, it could be, the DRC for copper, cobalt, all of those things.
I think the battery case is really interesting, where we are actually seeing some localization happening, right? And there are a number of companies now springing up in South Africa, looking at this without basically any policy really in place to support them, but simply on emerging demand. And as we have a battery round coming up at utility scale, etc., and obviously people embedding this in projects as well, it's been particularly interesting to watch. I mean, but do you think that you can form a loop with the mining sector and actually create some scale on this? Can South Africa actually be cost competitive in that, if it isn't in PV and other things versus competitors like China?
Look, it's not an easy one. If you look at our steel industry as an example, right, a lot of our iron ore kind of goes to China. A lot of our chrome goes to China, and they're able to produce the finished product much cheaper than we can in South Africa, right? So there's a lot that needs to be done, and I think it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's a generational thing where you've got to get your skill set right, you've got to get the education levels right, before you can actually solicit investment into manufacturing bricks and mortar, right? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and this requires long-term planning. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. And we should not be thinking in periods of 3 years or 5 years for an election term. We should be thinking 40 years, 50 years, if we are ever able to get our act together. And Singapore or the Asian tigers is a classic example. They do not have the natural resources that Africa is blessed with, but look what they've done to their economies, right? So I think we have a long way to go in that regard.
It is a similar parallel issue in question on hydrogen. We've seen the springing up very rapidly of hydrogen projects everywhere, including in Europe, which is not blessed with great renewables yields. Also in Namibia, in particular, has moved exceptionally fast in the last year. Australia as well. South Africa also wants to join the fray, but maybe is thinking rather large with the Boegoebaai project, which in the Northern Cape is potentially going to be huge. Some smaller projects as well. It feels like a very competitive market is emerging globally in this particularly quickly. And what do you think are the prospects for South Africa in that mix in terms of price, transport costs, etc.? I'm a little bit of a skeptic on this that everyone is magically going to produce this at a sort of $1 a kilo, as many of the consulting presentations say. Where do you see South Africa in that mix?
Yeah, Peter, I think we have a way to go. I mean, I think I talk now from the standpoint of a commercial bank, and we still see it as relatively newish technology. I mean, it's not new technology, but we still see a technology risk element attached to it. So I think as a commercial bank, we are probably, I would hazard a guess, say probably 3 years away before we get comfortable with easily being able to fund these things in mass at scale, right? So, I take a classic example of the project that Aqua Power has actually done, the hydrogen project in the Middle East, right? One of the big projects globally. That project was actually, there was a queue of local banks, regional banks, international banks desirous on actually getting involved and funding that. But as I understand it, and we are not a lender in that project, as I understand it, yes, the banks will all come in, but it's sponsor equity first, right? So the reality is, and that really speaks to the technology risk element, right? So I think the market certainly is there, there's no doubt. I think the issue really now is this whole theme of ESG and green. Everybody's kind of jumping on the bandwagon, but the reality is we know commercial banks are very averse to technology risks, and I don't think I would be able to get anything on the green hydrogen space through our credit committee anytime within the next month or two. So it's going to take us time to get our thoughts around that, to get comfortable with the technology. And we are happy to, watch the rest of the world do it first and learn from the best practice elsewhere, Europe and the US.
Exactly. I think that's a general view in the South African banking space. And given the risks, it's going to be very interesting to watch. A reminder to all our listeners, please do tap questions in the Q&A function. Very happy to pick those up and ask them. Just to dwell on some technology types briefly, we have a question on nuclear maybe to kick this off. Rosatom is starting construction, I think, today in Egypt on nuclear power. It's become incredibly controversial, obviously, in South Africa, but we also see some new technology emerging, like small modular reactors. They currently don't have a market price. There is no sort of sense of a commercial operation yet, but maybe they're interesting in 20, 30 years time for South Africa, who knows? But what's your thoughts as a bank on nuclear, on SMR in particular?
Look, I think there's different strokes for different folks, in my humble opinion, right? So I think the reality with nuclear is it is a relatively clean technology, right? It's renewable in a sense. You need a very small bit of fuel, uranium, to generate a lot of power. The issue with a nuclear power plant, though, is there's a lot of issues that go with it with regards to waste handling, with environmental issues, with regards to the long lead times to actually build these projects. And bear in mind the cost, the upfront cost. Now, nuclear plants have a useful life of up to 70 years. So on a unitized basis, on a levelized cost of energy basis, over a 70-year period for a baseload plant of 95% capacity factors, your unit costs are extremely low. But bear in mind that all of the major projects, whether it's Flammable in France or whether it's Hinkley Sea Point in the UK, all of these points have been severely delayed and have never been on time and on budget, right? So I think if we have the right sort of skill in a country, rolling out that becomes a bit more palatable. And if you've got deep pockets, from government to actually bail out these delays, then it's great. But I don't necessarily know if it's the best solution for South Africa, right? Because I think a lot of our skill has, when Eskom ran its pebble bed modular reactor, etc., a lot of that skill has actually left. We still have Africa's only nuclear plant in Koeberg, and our Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, Minister Mantashe, loves quoting that the Koeberg plant generates power at 23 rand cents per kilo, 23 US cents per kilowatt hour, I think he said it was, but which is, for baseload, it's probably not bad. But the reality is, there's a lot more that needs to be taken cognizance of. before we actually consider nuclear as the best case solution in South Africa. In the meantime, you have solar with falling battery storage costs, and in 5 years, that could potentially be a far more compelling solution than building a nuclear plant, which should take you 8 to 10 years before it's commissioned.
A global market may well emerge, right? And it may well fall in cost and be competitive in a number of years' time, but it seems a bit early to make a move on these technologies now, certainly. But the nuclear issue, also the gas issue as well, has raised a lot of hackles from activists, investors, for banks, NGOs, etc. That space is becoming a lot more noisy, a lot more litigious. In particular, we've seen that around Shell. We might see it in future around Car Powership as well in South Africa. How does that affect you as a bank, particularly as we see obviously Europe and the argument coming back to, we touched on it slightly earlier, Europe going back to coal as the narrative, etc. How do these activist investors and NGOs start to shape your policies and your lending as a bank?
I think Absa is a responsible lender that complies with the Equator Principles, and we certainly get sign off from our board on our lending policies with regards to different technologies within the energy space. And that includes coal, that includes gas, that includes renewable energy, etc. Coal certainly, is going to become a lot more difficult, if at all, to actually fund. And certainly, I think Absa looks at gas differently. We see gas as a transition fuel, and we are saying that if we are weaning ourselves off coal, there's got to be another intermittent solution that complements renewable energy generation, especially bearing in mind that wind and solar is variable and intermittent, and as a result needs to be complemented with another fuel source or another form of generation. And that we see, that's where we see gas playing a significant role. So as it stands right now, I think we will responsibly look at funding gas-fired power generation. We are of the opinion that there should be very different solutions for emerging markets, such as Africa, compared to the solutions or the yardstick you would measure these projects with in Western Europe and the US. Remember, Africa is a very small contributor to the greenhouse gas emissions, and I do not condone what's going on with climate change, etc. But Africa contributes 7% to the overall greenhouse gas emissions, right? So to say that we cannot do coal and we cannot do gas and should only be doing renewables, which is variable and where energy storage is not cost competitive, would be counterintuitive to the energy needs and of the continent. And if I cite a few examples, I look at Saudi Arabia, I look at China, I look at India. All of these countries have not signed the agreements at COP26, right? For them, they basically have said, look, we are still at the growth stage of our economies, we're emerging economies, and we are looking at 2050 or beyond for net zero. So why should we be treated any differently as Africa when we are such a small contributor to greenhouse gas emissions globally?
It feels like the gas debate in South Africa is also, has become a bit unanchored, right? There is certainly a gas lobby who wants 20 gigawatts of new gas to power and some crazy large numbers. But most people, most of the research, says there is certainly a role, and it's maybe of the order of 5, 6, 7 gigawatts of new gas to power. So it feels like the media debate is slightly divorced from the reality as well. But certainly a lot of, I think, pressure, a lot of legal risk on that front to watch out for. Dion in the chat has asked a question around regional hubs, and I think maybe to expand on Dion's question, with the transmission problems we have in South Africa, is there a risk or is there a need maybe to see more regional power hubs in South Africa that then sort of only over time will get connected up?
Within South Africa, you talk about. Well, look, I think this really Dion's question really speaks to what you're seeing in the form of distributed generation, right? Decentralized generation, right? I think if I look at South Africa, the energy grid was really designed for centralized generation, right? A lot of our coal-fired plants are in the Mpumalanga or Limpopo region, right? The coal belts of the country, right? But basically, renewable energy lends itself to a very different model. It actually allows you to build these plants at load centers, specifically where there's a demand for power, right? And I think that in itself will actually lead to different power hubs, or different the move away from the centralized generation to the decentralized generation. And that's a fact of what we are seeing globally. It's a trend in Europe. It's a trend, elsewhere in the US. And I think that it's no doubt not going to be any different in South Africa.
Then just to wrap up, just I think looking forward to COP 27, as I sort of mentioned at the start, we've seen relatively little movement after COP 26 on financing, private sector financing at scale, or some of the official sector financing actually coming through. What do you think are going to be some of the key themes that you would like to see, and that you think Africa in particular, as a continent, will be pushing into COP 27 that may provide a better route to success on some of the scale and catalytic financing?
Well, I hope it's not going to be another talk shop. I'd like to see more of the funds that have been pledged to Africa or South Africa really being crystallized into sort of tangible action, right, to actually help us get to our net zero targets sooner. That's really what I would like to say in a bold paintbrush. I think I was actually fortunate in chairing a panel recently at the African Energy Forum, and on the panel I had somebody from the European Union that was actually there, and he basically had provided an open invitation to various African governments saying, look, you tell us what you need, we will actually deploy the funds. So sometimes I think we're our own worst enemy in Africa, in that we don't really get our act together rapidly enough to actually solicit and lure investment. So I think we need to demonstrate that commitment as governments before we seek the funding or the FDI into our economies.
No, I think that's definitely a lesson from the JATP partnership financing is this need constantly for South Africa to tell the international community what it wants, right? There's a lot of philanthropic money now sort of sloshing around without particularly having a home yet, who again wants to be told where to go. And I think that's an important point you make to make that case very clearly. But I'm going to hand back to Sharon if you had a closing question and to wrap up.
Hi, thank you very much. Bhavtik, you've had me entranced listening to your input. And Peter, thank you for a very, very insightful questioning and covering such a wide ground. Maybe as a closing statement, Bhavtik, is how would you summarize the Africa Energy Forum from a point of view of Southern Africa? What will deliver, what won't deliver, of the key themes that you felt were pertinent to the actual conference itself and to potentially COP26 and the next forum?
I think, Sharon, I think green is the new gold, right? So definitely a huge investment, that actually exists from both lenders and from sponsors in the form of equity for anything green, right? I think I would definitely not disregard PPPs, right? So I think, as we know, we've spoken about a huge requirement for transmission infrastructure. Transmission has always been sensitive to governments in terms of wanting to hold that. It's a strategic asset, a strategic requirement. But I think there are many models globally where you can still have a PPP model for transmission, right? And it's within the electricity grid, it's quite possible for you to actually tender a certain portion of the grid, and you give that portion out to the private sector. Eskom or utility can still own a large majority, but bring in 40% or whatever into that of private sector involvement. That would alleviate the crunch that we have with regards to accessing liquidity to roll out the transmission grid rapidly. It would bring in the private sector expertise, it would bring in value for money, it would help us with the timelines, and ultimately, transmission is the precursor to actually getting more generation projects. So those are what I would say should be the key takeaways.
Thank you. Then that is very hopeful for South Africa, and I think everyone who is suffering level 6 load shedding from time to time would welcome these outcomes rolling out faster than ever. A big thanks to Bhavtik Vallabhjee for your insights, and to Peter Attard Montalto for ensuring those insights were elicited from him in the first place. Thank you for your insightful inquiry. And to all our participants, thank you very much for being with us. This is just another one in our series of state-owned enterprises and other key national initiatives that we'll be covering over the rest of the year. So thank you very much to everyone here, and thank you to my team, and thank you most importantly for all of those who joined us. There will be a recording hereafter. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.